Hello and welcome to E233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at our student course registration system. Specifically, we are going to take a look at some of the functions that are going to be found in our StaticArray.h. This video assumes that you've watched the earlier videos that focused on setting up our student course registration system demo, as well as focusing on how we start setting up our static array data structure. It would probably not be a bad idea if you went ahead and opened your scrs.h, your static array.h, as well as your core.h, so that we can reference any structures or constants that we might need, as well as making sure that you have a copy of your students.csv file available. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. In this particular video, we're going to focus in on our display student and display students functions. In the earlier video, we looked at how to import students from a file where we really were not able to do anything with it, or for that matter, even prove that we were successful at it. Instead, what we want to do is focus in on a pair of functions that will allow for us to look at each one of the students in our students array. And you'll notice that the difference between these two functions is that the display students with an S accepts an array of students as well as a count to indicate how many students are in the array, and the display student function, which is singular, accepts a single student and simply allows for us then to print out each one of the fields in a single student. Now, probably should take just a second to take a look at our scrs.h to be able to see what fields are available in a student type, as well as remind yourself of what the course type and registration type look like, because each of the display functions for these structures are going to be very, very similar. So let's go ahead and start with our student type. You'll notice that I have pulled up the function implementation for the display student. And what I'm going to do is simply go through after initializing our results and simply print out each one of the values for each one of the fields in our structure in sort of a table-like fashion. And for this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and include the status as well. So start off with a friendly looking description of each one of your fields, whether you do it verbatim from the field name or if you make it a little friendlier, a little easier to read, is perfectly fine. But basically give yourself enough room so that you can elaborate on each one of the fields, followed by the data type. In this case, for an enum, we're going to use the %d placeholder, and we're going to pass then the value of student.studentStatus to our printf. For our second printf statement, we're going to do something very similar. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the ID, which should be a string, so we'll use %s. And then in this case, then we're going to have student dot student ID. Oops. Let's go back there. And we'll do one more here. And at this point, you probably will have figured out the pattern. So we'll do our first name. And once again, whether you keep the exact syntax or similar syntax to the field names in the structure, or if in this case, for instance, you just make it look a little friendlier, first name, maybe capital F, and with no underscores, it's completely up to you. But the placeholder is once again going to be a %s, and then we have student first name, and then a little bit of copying and pasting, and you can handle the remaining fields. Now, also keep in mind, this could be your opportunity to hide some information from the user of your application. In other words, maybe you choose to not display all of your fields But in this case, what we're going to do is we are going to display all the fields in our structure, including our last name. And I'm simply lining up all of the format identifiers and just generally trying to make our printf statements look good. Now, what we'll do is we'll go back up earlier in our source file and we'll look for our display students, plural. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to loop through all of the elements in our students array up to the count. So in this case, what we're going to need is a integer index variable. And you can do this with either a for loop or a while loop. We're just going to stick with a for loop to start with. And we start off with index equals to 0. We continue while our index is less than our count. And we simply increment our index. Now note, we don't really do any error checking in this function or in the display student function. Particularly in this case, we would probably not have to worry about the count, for instance, being 0 or negative because this for loop is simply not run. We should consider doing perhaps some sort of validation on our students array, but for this video, we're just going to assume that we were passed a valid array. In which case, then what we're going to do is we're simply going to loop through all of the elements in this array of structures and simply pass then the individual student to the display student function. Notice once again, this is singular. And so what we'll pass here is going to be students utilizing the index to indicate which student we want to pass to the helper function. At this point, we should have our display students and display student working correctly. So we want to go ahead and build it. And now what we want to do is think about how can we test this. To do that, we'll go back to our student course registration system driver, which we've set up earlier. And you notice, or if not, go back and take a look at your instructions again. You'll see that there is a display all switch. The idea here is this is just a convenient way of testing to make sure our display students is in fact working correctly. The first thing that we would want to do is we would want to import the students before we attempt to display them. And in order to be able to import the students, we have to have the array that we wish to fill. And so in this particular case, you'll notice that since we're dealing with static arrays, and if you recall from the earlier video, then we said that we were not going to dynamically reallocate memory for our array. We were going to allocate it all at once, that you have to go ahead and create the array of the appropriate size to hold the students. And what we're going to do is we're going to create it a little larger than what we'll need, and we'll use then our constant that we have defined in our StaticArray.h, and that's going to be our student count max. Now, this is probably going to be much larger than you will need, but since once again, we're not going to be doing any reallocation of memory, we have to make it big enough for all of the students in our CSV file. So let's get started. We're going to go ahead and utilize our student type, and we're going to make an array that we're simply going to call students, and we're going to size it according to the student underscore count max. Now at this point, what we can do is in our display all switch, or in our branch here of our if statement, we can simply import the students and then display the students. And what we're going to do is we're going to leverage our students.csv file, which you should have already put in your MinGW directory. In other words, you should have went ahead and put it in the dist debug MinGW Windows directory, much like what I have done here. And the idea here is that we're going to loop through each one of the lines in the CSV file, importing the students like we did in our earlier video, build the array, and then turn around and display the array. So our first step is going to be to go ahead and import our students. We want to import them from a file called students.csv. Our student array is going to be the second parameter, so that's going to be our students array rather. And then we want to pass a by reference variable that is going to keep track of the actual number of students in our array, and we're just simply going to call that variable count. So what we need to do is come up here and go ahead and create one more variable called count. And we can go ahead and in one step go ahead and initialize this to 0, much like we did with our index. And then it probably also wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and create a results variable that we can use perhaps later on, also making that one an integer and initializing it to 0 so that we can simply capture then the return value from our import students. Now, initially, we're not going to do any additional error checking, but what you would do then is take a look at the value returned from import students, and from there determine whether you actually have anything to display. If you recall from the earlier video that the results, and we'll just take a quick look at it, the results from our import students was in fact exit success or exit failure, and the by reference count kept track of how many students were imported. So you've got a couple of different things that you could utilize here, both the return value from import students, but also your count variable to determine whether or not you even have any students to display. We then follow this up with a call to our display students plural function, and we pass to it our students array, and this time the count variable, but we do not pass the address of the count variable because we do not intend to change it. At this point then we can go ahead and build it. You're going to get a warning potentially about the fact that you are going to be utilizing a constant array. Don't be worried about that particular warning if you do get it. And we want to go ahead and open up a command line, cd to the appropriate directory. In this case, it's going to be my documents, courses, EE233, projects, my student course registration system demo, dist, debug, and MinGW. If I type in dir, you'll see not only my executable, but also the students.csv file. At this point, the only thing that we have to do then is make sure that we utilize the correct switch. I'm trying to move my command line out of the way here so we can see what the switch would be. In this case, it's going to be our display all. But you'll notice that in order to utilize this branch or to utilize the display all, the previous switch also needs to be student. So basically we have to pass the /student/display all to get this to work. So we'll start off, we'll have the name of the executable, /student/display all. And we got a slight delay and then no output, which indicates that we have a problem somewhere in our code. So the first thing that we probably want to do is to take a second to go ahead and see if we were in fact successful at importing our students. You'll see here that we earlier had put a printf statement in that tracks where we are in our main. In this case, it says display all of the students. So we know we've made it to line 43. Let's see if we've made it successfully through the import students before we start debugging. We'll just very simply come along here and we'll put another printf statement in, and we'll have our results followed by a %d and a new line, and we will populate that then with the value of the results variable. You can do the same thing after calling our display students, and then let's see how far our executable actually gets. So in this case, you'll notice that it appears to have crashed right after printing our display all of the students. So at this point, it seems like we do in fact have a problem in our import students, which we would have not picked up on earlier because we didn't actually test our import students. So here's what we want to do is we want to go ahead and set up our student course registration system demo for debugging by going to run, making sure that you've selected external terminal, and then in the run command, you want to go ahead and provide the same switches that you would have otherwise provided from the command line. In this case, /student/display all. Now, I encourage you to watch some of the earlier videos on debugging if you have not yet done so, because there's an additional step that we're going to want to take, and that is, in addition to the switches being passed to the executable, we also want to make sure that we have a copy of each one of the files that we'll be using, not only in the same folder as our executable, but if you're using NetBeans, you'll also want to have a copy of the CSV file in the root of the project folder. And you'll see here that I have my students.csv. At this point now, we should be ready to debug and figure out what is wrong with our import students. So the first thing we'll do is go into our import students and put a breakpoint somewhere in the function where we expect there might be a problem. At this point then, what you can do is right-click on the project itself, and you can simply select debug. At this point, it'll compile it. It will pass the switches to the executable, much like what you would have done from the command line. As a matter of fact, you can go ahead and verify that there are the arguments and just some minor differences in your argv *0. But at this point, you'll see that I have stopped at the breakpoint at the beginning of my import students function. So we're simply going to step through this one at a time, and you'll see that we're jumping into our string length, which we have no reason to believe that there's any problems with necessarily, but we're just going to go through it once just to make sure that it seems to be working out okay. And so if you'll notice in this particular case, it is actually determining then the length of our file name. And at this point then, our results should be 12, or the number of characters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 characters in our file name. So that seems to be working correctly. That doesn't seem to be our problem. So we're going to continue to step. In this case, you can step once again, or you can simply step over. And then at this point then, we'll just check to see if our string find function is working correctly, which so far it appears to be. And you can either continue to step if you don't believe, if you're not sure if there's a problem, or you can put a breakpoint at the end of a particular function and hit run. And you'll see here that our string find is determining how many of a particular substring is in a given string. In this case, our count is 1. So that seems to be working out okay. This is now going to return back to our import students. At which point now we're simply going to check to see if the students itself is equal to null. And that does not seem to be a problem, in which case we are now prepared to open our file. That seems to be successful. We, in an earlier video, checked to see that our file read line was working correctly. So what we'll do here is we're going to go ahead and assume that it is working correctly and simply step over. However, though, you'll see here that we threw an exception here, we threw a seg fault. So we do seem to have some sort of problem in our file read line. So what we'll do here then is go ahead and close this out. We'll stop debugging, and we'll actually go ahead and put a breakpoint inside of our file read line. And we will once again go back to our student course registration system demo and go ahead and debug it. And at this point, what we can do is we can simply hit continue, and we can remove some of the earlier breakpoints so that we stop now inside of our file read line. At this point, what we want to do is we want to verify that we have, in fact, a non-null input file pointer, which that seems to be working correctly. And then you'll notice here that I am passing by reference a line or an array of characters that is going to be a string, because we're going to append the end of string on it, at which point then we can simply step into our function. And we'll see here, it appears as if one of our conditions here has triggered our while loop to exit early. So in this case, let's take just a second to figure out what is in fact wrong here. A quick examination of our code indicates that our count variable was in fact never initialized. This was an error that I believe that I had fixed in an earlier video, but seems to have cropped up again. You'll notice here that our count basically has a garbage value in it. How did I deduce that? Well, I simply went through and I looked at each one of the conditions inside of our compound condition for our while loop. This one right here, for instance, shouldn't have returned a end of file, in which case what we can do is we can simply just copy the fscanf into the expression evaluation, and you'll see that it did in fact return something. You can also check to see what the individual chunk was, and you'll see that it was not equal to a new line, which left us only to look then at this third condition, and we have definitely not reached our chunk length max, which leaves us then to believe that our count is erroneous. So we'll go ahead and stop debugging. We'll go ahead and fix this problem here, and that we will initialize our count equal to 0. We'll go ahead and save it. We'll go ahead and build it. And at this point, we're probably ready to go ahead and run it from the command line once again. And in this case, it does appear that we have been successful at reading in the values from the file and then displaying them one by one. And so for just a second here, I'm going to go ahead and split the screen just to make sure that we are clear on what's going on here. So we first import all of the values from our CSV file using our import students function, and essentially this populates this students array and also keeps track of the number of successfully imported students. And then we turn around and we make a call to our display students, also leveraging the count or the number of students that were successfully imported. And the display students simply loops through that array, making calls to our display student singular, which then has the responsibility of printing out each one of the field names. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to ask, and thank you for watching.